Life of Science, on Indian Science Congress, The Hindu. The Indian Science Congress, ISC, its 107th edition is underway in Bengaluru, has served as a reminder of the status accorded to science and technology in the early years of the Indian Republic. Though the formation of the Congress predates the Indian Republic, it was the intellectual nursery of modern science in the country. Early ideas of how science and technology could aid the development of the new nation were incubated at this coming together of scientists. It is for this reason that the Congress, normally held in the first week of January, is inaugurated by the Prime Minister. The years since have seen the nature of the Congress change from one where scientists, in the era of postal communication, congregated to exchange scientific ideas to one today where it has become a science mela. The prime purpose of the ISC now is to draw school and science college students to hear Nobel laureates and Indian origin scientists from abroad to lecture about their work and the future prospects of science. The other draws are science projects and innovations by schoolchildren and stalls showcasing scientific work being done in key national laboratories and institutions. But there is an unmistakable decay, a choreographed ennui, that has set in. In recent years, the Congress often makes news for becoming a forum for pseudoscience and less for interesting scientific ideas or demonstrations. Speakers, some holding distinguished positions in leading universities, have tended to mix mythology and science and publicize far-fetched assertions that the Kauravas were born from stem cell technology and the Vedas discussed avionics. While this has eroded the Congress's public image, the government itself does not seem too keen to vitalize it. The exhibits at several scientific laboratories are reruns from old congresses, or from similar and past science fairs. Many laboratories showcase their work as posters, rather than actually showing demonstrations or working inventions. Several luminaries of India's science establishments, the principal scientific advisor, secretaries from several ministries, the chiefs of major organizations such as ISRO or the Department of Atomic Energy, who have been fixtures, or have at least had their organization present a dedicated talk or session, were absent this year. It is inevitable that traditions change over time and the relative importance accorded to institutions wax and wane. However, this must make way for inspiring new ideas, or new models of taking science to the public. A rising trend in science displays, at museums or exhibitions in many places, is to mix science and art as well as make interactive displays that encourage audience engagement. A rebirth, and not a creeping requiem, is what the Congress needs. Least surprise, on Tamil Nadu local body poll results, The Hindu. The only surprise in the December 2019 elections to rural local bodies in Tamil Nadu was that there was no surprise. Held after 8 years, the polls, which were due in October 2016, were relatively peaceful, with around 77% of voters, nearly 2 crore people, exercising their franchise in 27 of 36 districts to elect their representatives for village panchayats, panchayat unions and district panchayats. The results reaffirmed that much of the state's political space continues to remain with the DMK and the ruling AIA-DMK. Some churn was thought possible in the light of the debate on the perceived vacuum in political leadership in the state. The DMK-led front, it 38 one of the 39 Lok Sabha seats last year, has retained its lead over its arch-rival with a higher tally of wards in panchayat unions and district panchayats, the elections to which are on political lines. However, the fact that the AIA-DMK, an important ally of the Bharatiya Janata Party, has been able to bridge some of the gap with the DMK was also in keeping with the results in the assembly by-elections in October last. Clearly, both parties have reasons to believe that their prospects in the 2021 assembly polls are good. Though the ruling party appears to have regained much of its support base lost during the parliamentary polls, this being the first statewide electoral contest in the last 7 months, the reality that it finished behind its key adversary in the overall tally of the local bodies wards is a situation that will not be to the liking of its leadership. The perception is that the AIADMK is traditionally stronger in the rural areas. Finally, political mobilization against the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 is believed to be a factor that influenced voters against the ruling party. The State Election Commission (SEC), which conducted itself reasonably well with new measures such as the use of flying squads and closed-circuit television sets, should stick to its plan of holding the polls to urban local bodies including the Greater Chennai Corporation and abide by the Supreme Court's direction of completing the poll process for rural local bodies in the remaining 9 districts within 3 months. It should note that the reason behind the court granting more time is for carrying out fresh delimitation of wards in 5 new districts. The panel should also ensure that the poll process is always fair and credible. It would be in the fitness of things for the state government to assist the SEC in ensuring the early completion of the next round of polls. Any delay will not reflect well on the SEC and the ruling party. For the AIADMK, it will be an occasion for course correction. For the DMK, the message is that it cannot be complacent. It is the front runner, but the AIADMK is regaining momentum. Rebooting the economy, the Indian Express. By Editorial, published January 6, 2024 hours 0 minutes and 40 seconds am. That windfall could come under threat if crude prices go up with increased U.S.-Iran geopolitical tensions and the Modi government, unwisely, if at all, cuts duties or forces oil companies to absorb part of the burden. Heightened uncertainty in West Asia following the U.S. airstrike killing Iran's top military commander has thrown the spotlight again on oil. In the last 3 months, Brent crude prices have risen from about $58 to almost $69 per barrel. It is true that the US and Russia have displaced Saudi Arabia as the world's largest crude producers today, with the former's output especially more than doubling from roughly 5.5 million to 12.9 million barrels per day in the last decade. As a result, the Persian Gulf region's control over global supplies isn't as much as during the 2003 or 1991 Iraq War. But that's hardly any consolation for India, which cannot, for purely geographical reasons, source crude beyond a point from the likes of the US, Venezuela and Russia. The Narendra Modi government's first term was marked by falling international oil prices. It did not, wisely, pass these on fully to consumers and, instead, netted a yearly revenue windfall of some 150,000 crore rupees by raising excise duties on petrol and diesel. That windfall could come under threat if crude prices go up with increased US-Iran geopolitical tensions and the Modi government, unwisely, if at all, cuts duties or forces oil companies to absorb part of the burden. Rising oil prices can also impact India's balance of payments in the rupee. The domestic currency shed 44 paise against the dollar on Friday, further adding to inflationary pressures. But it's not just oil and rupee. There is a third component that contributed to benign inflation during the Modi government's first term: low food prices. Annual consumer food inflation crossed single digits in November, which was for the first time in nearly 6 years. Many commodities, from onion, potato, pulses and milk to maize and soybean, have seen prices rising or at least correcting from lows. The reasons for it are partly weather-induced, excess rains during September-October, and partly structural, farmers reducing production in response to the earlier sustained low realizations. Either way, benign food and fuel inflation can no longer be taken for granted. All this, of course, makes the job of growth and investment revival that much tougher. The return of inflation, on top of pressure on government revenues, leaves very little space for both monetary and fiscal policy. The focus has to necessarily shift to structural reforms that have been put off for too long. The existing system of open-ended procurement of wheat and paddy at minimum support prices has to go. So must super-subsidized physical sales of grain or urea. These should be replaced by direct cash transfers targeting vulnerable consumers and smallholder farmers. The resources thus freed, along with those raised through privatization, inclusive of excess land parcels held by government departments, enterprises, can fund much-needed public investment without creating fiscal or inflationary pressures. Tableaus of Exclusion, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published, January 6, 2024 hours 5 minutes and 29 seconds am. Only 16 states have been selected for the parade, and government and BJP spokespersons insist that there is no political bias at play in the selection. It is a sign of the fraught and polarized times we live in that even the Republic Day parade has been dragged into the over-politicized conversation that now stands in for meaningful public discourse. The tableaus that form an integral part of the parade, highlighting the culture of various states, union territories and even the mandate of union ministries, are now a front in the battle between the center and non-BJP-ruled states. Maharashtra, Kerala, West Bengal and Bihar are among the states that have been excluded from the parade, and are crying foul. The governments of both West Bengal and Kerala have drawn a connection between their rejection of the CAA-NRC and exclusion from the parade. The selection of tableaus is done by a committee under the Union Ministry of Defense. Only 16 states have been selected for the parade, and government and BJP spokespersons insist that there is no political bias at play in the selection. They have also cited the fact that in the past, tableaus have been rejected when there were Congress governments both at the center and in the states concerned. It is by the same process that the current selection has been made. This is essentially a procedural justification for what has become a political issue, and, therefore, is unlikely to cut ice with the aggrieved states. Arguably, more than any other government in recent times, the Narendra Modi-led government is acutely aware of the potency of political symbolism and optics. To be seen as excluding entire states whose elected governments have stood in opposition to the NRC and CAA will certainly strain already fraying center-state relations. Just because West Bengal has been opposing anti-people policies of the BJP government, like the CAA-NRC, stepmotherly treatment is being meted out to the state, West Bengal's Minister of State for Parliamentary Affairs Tapas Roy said. And Kerala Minister A.K. Balan asked if the centre was against the Malayali people. It is certainly possible, as the Ministry of Defence insists, that the exclusions are purely procedural. The current climate of division and suspicion makes it incumbent on the centre to not conform to its image as being overbearing on the back of its majority in Parliament. The Republic Day parade in India has always been much more than a celebration of masculine nationalism and militarism, it bears testimony to the diversity of India. The Mask of Anarchy, on JNU Violence, The Hindu. Chilling and brutal, the visuals of the rampage of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, in New Delhi on Sunday night by a mob of masked criminals will torment the country's conscience for a long time to come. The mob ransacked hostels and grievously wounded students, professors and staff, going about it all in methodical madness for several hours. Not a single attacker was detained by the Delhi police, deployed in large numbers outside the campus. The street lights were turned off and the police personnel appeared to have given cover for the mob that leisurely walked away with abusive slogans. This evil will outlive its perpetrators and facilitators, and the night will continue to haunt India's dreams to mature itself as a democracy and as a society that treasures its institutions. The masks notwithstanding, it is not difficult to see the faces behind this outrageous assault on one of India's premier institutions where access is not limited by pedigree or purse. The Hindutva dispensation's extreme intolerance towards intellectualism in general, and institutions in particular, has been on naked display since 2014. JNU has been a special target, and that itself is telling. JNU recruits from India's vast diversity, and offers its students the best opportunity to develop critical thinking and excel in their chosen paths of life. This liberating potential and the questioning spirit of JNU has long been reviled by a political project that seeks to erase the distinction between myth and history, faith and fanaticism, and criticism and subversion. The charge that the Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, the student outfit of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, led this violence is credible, unless the serious injuries suffered by the students and teachers were self-inflicted. The list is long of those who stood behind the masks, and some of the faces are recognizable. The JNU's administration and its Vice-Chancellor M. Jagadesh Kumar have not merely failed in their duty as teachers and guardians, they have come across as desecrators of a place whose sanctity they were ordained to protect. The Delhi police, under its current commissioner Amulya Patnaik, which had shown such alacrity in enforcing order recently that they stormed the library of Jamia Millia Islamia, stood by not as bystanders but as collaborators. Though they did not wear masks, they had their identities concealed by not wearing name badges. The Delhi administration apparently concluded that they had no responsibility whatsoever. There is little credence to the vague words of protest coming from some BJP functionaries and ministers. The only way the centre and Prime Minister Narendra Modi can prove that this mayhem was not sanctioned is to come down heavily on the police inaction and bring the mobsters to exemplary justice. Exit Iraq. On U.S.-Iran tensions, The Hindu. The vote by Iraqi parliamentarians in favor of a resolution seeking to expel American troops on Sunday was the first blowback the U.S. faced after it assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani inside Iraq on Friday. The outcome of the vote was expected as the lawmakers were under pressure from both the public and militias to act against the U.S. after the killing. The U.S. troops, which are in Iraq on an invitation from the Iraqi government to fight the Islamic State, have carried out air strikes against Iraqi militias in recent weeks, without the approval of the Baghdad government. This triggered public protests and led to the siege of the American embassy last week. In an already explosive situation, the killing of Soleimani acted as a catalyst. The anger among Iraqi lawmakers towards U.S. actions was on full display inside the Parliament Hall on Sunday when they chanted, "America out, Baghdad remains free," before the voting. Parliament itself doesn't have the authority to expel foreign troops. But a resolution passed in Parliament is a call to the executive branch to act. Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi, who condemned the killing of Soleimani, has stated unambiguously that it is time for the Americans to go home. Government officials have already started working on a memorandum on the legal and procedural formalities to expel U.S. troops, according to him. Iraq is a crucial ally for the U.S. in the war against terrorism in West Asia, and the Trump administration has nobody to blame but itself for the setback. It pushed the Iraqis to a point where they had to choose between Tehran and Washington. And understandably, they picked their powerful neighbor. But U.S. President Donald Trump still doesn't seem to be in a mood to listen. He has threatened Iraq with sanctions and a bill for billions of dollars if the U.S. troops are forced to pull back. This approach not only violates Iraq's sovereignty, it also escalates the situation to a three-cornered crisis involving the U.S., Iraq and Iran. Mr. Trump is primarily responsible for today's situation. His decision to pull the U.S. out of a functioning Iran nuclear deal was the trigger. when the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Iran, it was up to the other signatories of the deal, European countries, Russia and China, to save the agreement. Iran waited for a year before taking countermeasures. But they did nothing, barring issuing occasional statements in favor of the agreement. Europe, which has good ties with both the US and Iran, should wake up at least now. It should use its diplomatic channels to rein in Mr. Trump and pacify Iran to prevent an all-out war. As a first step of de-escalation, what Mr. Trump could do is to order his soldiers to pack their bags and leave Iraq. Power to the goon, the Indian Express. By Editorial, updated, January 7, 2029 hours 26 minutes and 13 seconds am. A narrative of aggressive nationalism was carefully nurtured to normalize the vilifying of the university and its inhabitants, dog-whistling that targeting JNU has the sanction of the government. The vicious attack on students and teachers in JNU by a group of goons, allegedly affiliated to the RSS student wing ABVP, on Sunday night is not merely a case of campus violence peaking. It is the outcome of the daily demonizing of the university, its staff and faculty, over a period of time by people holding high public office. The mob that went on a rampage in the campus, including in girls' hostels, was empowered by the very government that is vested with the power and responsibility to uphold law and order, to act as it did. It did not happen in a day, of course, it has been in the works ever since JNU was seen by the establishment as a rebel outpost. Students and faculty have been branded anti-nationals, who need to be punished. Phrases like Tukde gang, an urban Naxal were used by BJP functionaries, including senior ministers, to describe students and cases foisted on student leaders. A narrative of aggressive nationalism was carefully nurtured to normalize the vilifying of the university and its inhabitants, dog-whistling that targeting JNU has the sanction of the government. Follow live updates on JNU violence. 2 members of the Union Cabinet, both JNU alumni, have condemned the incident. But this rings hollow. Visuals of hooligans roaming in dormitories and the campus, wielding hockey sticks and bludgeons, shouting, "K Gataro Ko, Goli Maro Salo Ko," and finally trooping out of the campus, under the benign gaze of Delhi police, are available in the public domain. Delhi police, which the other day was seen wreaking havoc on the Jamia Millia Islamia campus, has been coy to act against the thugs who had a free run in JNU. The vandals have been aided and abetted by the institutions that ought to have cracked down on them in the first place. What is the message that is sent out? Who is to act against the hooligans? How long before such mob transforms itself into lynch bands that have murdered people in the name of food and faith in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan and Jharkhand in recent years? Read, unmasked on WhatsApp, JNU Chief Proctor to aid ABVP office bearers. The wardens of JNU hostels that faced the brunt of the thugs have quit their posts, taking responsibility for failure to protect students. The University Vice-Chancellor, M. Jagadesh Kumar, a divisive presence in the campus at the best of times, seems to run the university as a department of the Union Human Resources Development Ministry, its strings pulled by Union Home Ministry. Clearly, his fidelity is not to the students and staff, his tenure is remarkable for its failure in winning the trust of the campus. Kumar should be relieved of the responsibility he has long abdicated. But for that to happen, saner heads need to prevail, who understand that a campus where goons are empowered is a campus that will shrivel and shrink a nation's future. JNU violence reflects an apocalyptic politics driven by a constant need to find new enemies, the Indian Express. Written by Pratap Banu Mehta, updated, January 7, 2020 10 hours 3 minutes and 29 seconds am. Scuffle between JNU students and ABVP supporters right outside the main gate of JNU. Express photo by Abhinav Saha. The shocking violence at JNU should convince you of one simple proposition: India is governed by a regime whose sole raison d'etre is to find an adversarial rallying point and crush it by brute force. Cowardly thugs running amok in one of India's most premier universities, inflicting head injuries on teachers and students, is not a minor scuffle explained away by JNU's local conflicts. To better understand what is at stake, it is important to listen to the entire range of speeches our Honorable, he who must not be named, Home Minister delivers. One thing will become abundantly clear. The current political regime cannot exist unless it finds a new enemy. It now legitimizes itself, not by its positive accomplishments, but by using the enemy as a rallying point. The targeting of enemies, minorities, liberals, secularists, leftists, urban Naxals, intellectuals, assorted protesters, is not driven by a calculus of ordinary politics. It is driven by will, ideology and hate, pure and simple. When you legitimize yourself entirely by inventing enemies, the truth ceases to matter, normal restraints of civilization and decency cease to matter, the checks and balances of normal politics cease to matter. All that matters is the crushing of real and imaginary enemies, by hook or by crook. The events at JNU are another symbol of the apocalyptic politics this government is playing. It is apocalyptic in a triple sense. At the level of discourse, the normalization of the phrase Tuk Day gang, abetted by the Home Minister, with the help of a pliant media, laid the background conditions for this kind of violence. Follow live updates on JNU violence. There is no doubt that many of those who were cowardly enough to assault unarmed professors and students and hit them on the head, see themselves as some kind of nationalist warriors, avenging national honor by unleashing violence in a university. But the fact that they think in this way has been enabled by the larger ideological climate, something government functionaries have done much to inculcate. There is no getting away from the fact that hunting down your own citizens as anti-national is now part of the ideological construct of this government, as evidenced by the Home Minister's speeches. There is no getting away from the fact that the kind of state response that you have seen in Up Against Minorities, on the heels of the tepid response to earlier episodes of lynching, emboldens the worst elements of our society to act as vigilantes. The state will, directly or through proxies, encourage violence against anyone who is not in tune with it. Try watching this video on, or enable JavaScript if it is disabled in your browser. This violence is apocalyptic in another sense. Its purpose is to foment more violence, so that targeting enemies becomes self-fulfilling. The logic is, apply force and intimidation. If it succeeds, all well and good. If it does not succeed, respond in two ways. One is to ideologically discredit the opposition even more. The pattern is depressingly familiar. The attacks on JNU will be presented as some kind of left-liberal conspiracy. They will intone, as many are doing on social media, these left liberals are so fanatical that they will smash their own skulls to embarrass government. The second strategy is to use the violence as a pretext for more control and violence. See these anti-nationals, they refuse to be crushed by violence. So, we need more violence. This is the strategy in Kashmir, this is the strategy in Up, and now it is coming to the heart of the capital. There will be a massive disinformation campaign. Remember, the government exploits the asymmetry between doubt and truth. It will use odd bits of information, without context, to buttress its claims that this is a conspiracy. Meanwhile, the most obvious questions will go unanswered. Let us for a moment assume there was a local scuffle between students, those wanting to register and other students preventing them from the registering process. That cannot explain the fact that armed goons from outside the campus were allowed to run amok. That does not explain the fact that the police, which had no compunction in cracking down in Jamia, stood by as mute spectators and even respectfully seemed to have escorted out the thugs. That cannot explain why unarmed professors and students would be hit in the head. The government is counting on the fact that it thinks we are looking for a pretext to support it. It thinks pictures of disorder, the specter of rioting minorities or leftists, will increase support for authoritarianism. The worst indictment of India is that the government thinks the people are behind it in this apocalyptic vision. Editorial, a campus where goons are empowered as one that will shrivel and shrink a nation's future. The third apocalyptic element of the vision is the literal destruction of all institutions. The most pathetic moment of the long night was two, who do not deserve to be named, ministers, the finance minister and minister of external affairs, reduced to tweeting a general, anodyne condemnation of violence. They are members of the Cabinet Committee on Security. They could have arranged, through their colleagues, for Delhi police to act. If they, with their privileges, exude this kind of pathetic helplessness, think of the ordinary JNU student or citizen in Up or Kashmir. Think of those who are the target of vigilante violence and have no recourse to justice. Think of those whose homes were invaded by Up police. Think of those who have disappeared in Kashmir. The aim of the government may or may not be literal annihilation of its citizens. But its aim certainly is that it annihilates our will, our reason, our spirit, so that we all become willing supplicants in its ideological project. The silver lining is that, as recent events have shown, enough Indians are refusing to be cowed down. This is embittering and shaking the government and its supporters even more. In the short run, we need three things. There has to be an absolute refusal to patronize anyone who normalizes the Tukde gang talk, licensing the militarization of domestic politics. There has to be institutional accountability, from the JNUVC to the Home Minister. But this moment will also require the forces of protests to be more visible in the peaceful and dignified way they have been over the last few days. The government's strategy is not to solve old issues, it is to divert attention by bringing in new adversaries in the hope that we remain divided. But now the movement against the government has to turn this very fact into an advantage. The one thing the violence in JNU, and Delhi more generally, should bring home is that plain truth: in the eyes of this government, no one is innocent. A battle over welfare, on Delhi Assembly polls, The Hindu. Delhi, the Union Territory (UT), that hosts India's capital city, might lag behind several states in total population and in area, but it enjoys outsized significance in terms of media and political attention. With 1.47 crore electors spread across the largely metropolitan national capital region and its pockets of rural voters in some suburbs, Delhi is expected, in polls scheduled on February 8, to reprise the three-cornered electoral fight which has been the norm in recent elections. The Aam Aadmi Party, which graduated from a social movement to a political party less than a decade ago, will now seek to stand on its governance record, 5 years after nearly sweeping the assembly results in 2015. The Bharatiya Janata Party will hope that, unlike in Maharashtra, Jharkhand and Haryana, the legions of voters who supported it in the Lok Sabha election will not transfer their votes to its competitors, while the Congress will seek to regain the support of the UT's poorer and marginalized sections, most of whom shifted allegiance to the AAP in 2015. The AAP, if multiple opinion polls are to be believed, is on a strong wicket despite its setback in the Lok Sabha election where it won only 18% of the votes for the third place behind the BJP's 56.6% and the Congress's 22.5%. A Center for the Study of Developing Societies Lokniti survey of May 2019 found that most of Delhi's voters who voted against the AAP for other parties in the national elections wanted the party to return to power in the assembly election. This dichotomy in support could be explained by the reasonable satisfaction among voters with the welfare and development work done by the Arvind Kejriwal-led government. A PRS legislative research report has shown that Delhi spends the most, nearly 40% of its overall budget allocation compared to an average of 23% elsewhere in India, on education, health, water supply and sanitation between 2011 and 2019. The AAP's focus on improving government-run primary education, healthcare, the Mohalla Clinic scheme in particular, lowering electricity and water supply costs besides easing public transport woes through schemes such as free ridership for women in government-run buses, has earned the party strong campaign points. This could not yield a dividends in May, as the party still does not have a coherent ideological position or a national presence, while voters were concerned with other issues such as national security that favored the BJP. The AAP's incoherence on questions related to ideology was a drawback then, and that is the reason why it will seek to turn the polls into a referendum on its tenure. The BJP hopes to challenge the AAP on this turf after passing a bill in December 2019 that came up with a legal framework to provide ownership rights to those living in Delhi's unauthorized colonies. Whether this recent gesture, that is of importance to the roughly 5 million people in such areas, will sway voters remains to be seen. None for 4, on test format. The Hindu. Brevity and quicksilver processes constitute a raging trend, be it Twitter or 2-minute noodles. It is in sync with the current era, notorious for its shrinking attention spans and paucity of time. Organized sport too isn't immune from this need to shorten formats. In this universe of instant gratification, Test cricket with its 5-day schedule and breaks for lunch and tea might seem an anachronism. It may boggle the mind that there were timeless tests in the past during which a contest stretched beyond 5 days till a result was arrived at. That phase ended in 1939 as visiting squads were constrained by the urgency to catch a ship back home. Since those days of the slow life, cricket evolved and tests now have 2 raucous siblings in one-day internationals and 2020s, where a result is inevitable and the thrills, however transitory, seem limitless in these abridged formats. Otis and T20s draw in the crowds and sponsors, while tests are now seen as an aging matriarch lost to nostalgia and the prospect of ever-dwindling revenues. In a bid to bolster cricket's original form, the International Cricket Council (ICC) is mulling over 4-day tests from 2023. Cold logic has trumped relevance, and it is a move that will destroy the sanctity of tests and all that it stood for. The tussle spread over 5 days is considered as the ultimate benchmark for judging cricketing greatness. Batsmen have to cope with fast bowlers on a fresh first-day pitch and also counter wily spinners on a wearing surface on the 5th day. The action gathers steam over 4 days before a spectacular combustion on the concluding day. Yes, in recent times many tests have finished within 3 or 4 days, and broadcasting companies that spend top dollar for telecast rights have to craft studio analysis to justify their ad inventory. Another factor is that the ICC is keen to create more space for various T20 leagues ranging from the Indian Premier League to the Big Bash in Australia, besides supporting the World Cup for 2020s. However, a 4-day test will lack character. Imagine what would have happened during that epical march in the summer of 2001 at Kolkata's Eden Gardens, where VVS. Laxman, Rahul Dravid and Harbhajan Singh inspired India to stun Steve Waugh's Australians. If that test had ended as a mere draw in 4 days, Indian cricket may not have progressed over the last decade and a half. A 5-day test is the acme, a 4-day one will slowly blur the distinction with limited overs cricket, and it is a clear and present danger that players such as Sachin Tendulkar, Ricky Ponting and Virat Kohli have recognized. It is time the ICC woke up to this reality. Sobering account, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published, January 8, 2020, 12 hours 23 minutes and 14 seconds am. At the aggregate level, growth in gross value added (GVA) is expected to fall to 4.9% in FY20, down from 6.6% in FY19. India's economy is expected to grow this year at the slowest pace in more than a decade, with both private consumption and investment faltering. GDP growth has been pegged at a mere 5% in 2019-20 by the National Statistics Office, NSO, in line with the Reserve Bank of India's, RBI, earlier estimate. The NSO numbers imply that economic activity is expected to pick up only marginally in the second half at around 5.2%, underlining the view that the recovery will be a protracted process. What is equally worrying is that nominal GDP growth, which has implications for the fiscal math, is pegged at 7.5% for the full year, much lower than the 12% growth projected in the last union budget. At the aggregate level, growth in gross value added (GVA) is expected to fall to 4.9% in FY20, down from 6.6% in FY19. Government spending is expected to drive growth this year. Excluding public administration, defense and other services, which largely connotes government spending, gross value added by the rest of the economy is projected to grow by an even lower 4.3% this year. But with government revenues coming under pressure, its gross tax revenues have grown by a mere 0.81% in the first 8 months of this year. It is debatable whether this higher government spending can be maintained over the second half of this year. The NSO expects government spending to grow at 13.7% current prices. How it manages this conundrum in the face of pressure to stick to the fiscal deficit target will be clear when it presents the budget in a few weeks from now. The performance of the other sectors in the economy is expected to remain lackluster. Manufacturing activity is expected to slow down to a mere 2% in FY20, from 6.9% in FY19. A similar slowdown is expected in the construction sector, trade, hotels, transport and communication, as well as the financial, real estate and professional services sector. Household demand is also expected to moderate to 5.8% this fiscal, down from 8.1% in the previous year, while investment activity is expected to remain almost flat, growing at a mere 1% this year, down from 10% in the previous year. With these growth estimates differing remarkably from the projections factored in the last budget, and with revenue falling well short of expectations, the finance minister must present an honest assessment of the economy as well as the state of government finances in the upcoming budget. This would provide clarity on the fiscal space available to the government for supporting the economy. But the government should also realize the limits of a fiscal and monetary stimulus. Who's police? The Indian Express. By Editorial, published January 8, 2020, 12 hours 32 minutes and 8 seconds am. The crackdown in Jamia ignited student protests in campuses across India, which is continuing. That's why how Delhi police handles the JNU probe will be keenly watched. Delhi police is a strange beast. It does not report to the elected government of the state where it functions. However, the fact that it comes under the Union Ministry of Home Affairs, MHA, has never been so stark as it is now. Police action in Jamia Millia Islamia during protests against the new citizenship law and the inaction in JNU on Sunday allowing hooligans to go on a rampage in the campus have cast a shadow over the force. In these instances, Delhi police is perceived to have acted in a partisan manner with the intent to protect its master's preferences at the cost of its mandate to enforce law and order without prejudice. Such conduct has had repercussions, in and beyond the capital. The crackdown in Jamia ignited student protests in campuses across India, which is continuing. That's why how Delhi police handles the JNU probe will be keenly watched. It is now up to the force to restore its credibility as a free and fearless enforcer of the law or be derided as a mere security wing of the MHA. The JNU probe, however, has started on the wrong note. The first FIR, filed on Tuesday, was against the JNU Students' Union president Aish Ghosh, who was beaten up by the goons, allegedly affiliated to the RSS students' wing ABVP. This seems to be aimed at firming up the narrative that the violence in JNU was merely a clash between rival student groups over the semester registration process. Sunday's incident was much more than the scaled-up version of campus violence. Police reportedly did not respond to calls for help from the campus. Visuals of armed thugs leaving the campus after thrashing students and teachers under the watch of police personnel remain fresh in public memory. That not one of them was apprehended by the policemen waiting outside the JNU gates speaks poorly about the competence of the force. Failure on the part of Delhi police to clarify these questions will stain its record. The AAP government, as part of its larger campaign for statehood, has often accused Delhi police of working like an armed wing of the BJP. Evidence of the last few days reinforces this. Delhi police brass has a task in hand: it must remove apprehensions about its neutrality and reclaim its credibility. It could begin by earning the trust of the JNU campus community. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. From the brink of war, on US-Iran conflict, The Hindu. The latest spell of conflict between the US and Iran turned full circle on Wednesday when Tehran launched ballistic missile attacks at American troops in 2 military bases in Iraq in retaliation for the assassination of Maj. Gen. Qasem Soleimani. In its first direct attack on U.S. forces, Iran targeted Erbil, the capital of the Iraqi Kurdistan in the north, and al-Assad in the west, which is some 400 kilometers away from the Iranian border. The attacks were both an act of retaliation and a show of its capability. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter, which allows member states to take military actions in self-defense if they come under attack. He said Iran has taken and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense, which can be interpreted that Iran is now ready for de-escalation. The man who is primarily responsible for the current explosive situation is U.S. President Donald Trump. His decision to kill Soleimani, a top Iranian military leader who commanded the elite Quds force for over 2 decades, in the Iraqi capital, was practically an act of war, forcing the Islamic regime to respond. However, despite the wide range of rhetoric issued by Iranian military leaders and hardline politicians, what Tehran actually did was to launch a calculated, limited strike. It is as much an act of revenge as an opportunity for de-escalation. The Pentagon's assessments suggested there were no American casualties and only minimal damage in the attacks. Mr. Trump, in his response later on Wednesday, has signaled that he was backing away from further conflicts with Iran. If the U.S. had responded with air strikes or missile attacks inside Iran, it could have triggered further attacks from Iran, setting off a cycle of violence and aggression. A direct shooting match between the U.S. and Iran would have been disastrous for the whole of West Asia. Iran may be a weaker power compared to America's conventional military might, but it is a formidable rival. It not only has ballistic missiles and a wide range of rockets but also a host of militias under its command across the region. It could have made an invasion and air strikes on its territories extremely costly for the U.S. and its allies. It could also have disrupted global oil supply by attacking the Gulf waterways. By any assessment, a direct war would have been catastrophic. Mr. Trump did well to step back and not push the Gulf region into a disastrous cycle of violence and destruction. The international community should now push for a diplomatic settlement of the crisis and find ways to revive the nuclear deal, which could bring long-term peace to the Gulf. And Iran should seize this opportunity for de-escalation. Reality check on Government projecting slower GDP growth. The Hindu. The government's advance estimates for economic output and growth for the fiscal year ending in March may raise eyebrows, but only for the wrong reasons. The National Statistical Office (NSO) has estimated that gross domestic product (GDP) will expand by 5% in the 12-month period, in line with the Reserve Bank of India's sharp downward revision last month in its full-year growth forecast, from 6.1% projected earlier, to 5%. The NSO's estimate is a full 2 percentage points lower than the 7% figure that the Economic Survey had projected on the eve of the newly elected government's annual budget in July, reflecting the continued sharp slide in momentum. However, disconcertingly, even the latest growth assumption appears grounded more on optimism than on real hard data. Given that the pace of growth slumped to a 6.5-year low of 4.5% in the second quarter, thus dragging the first half's expansion to 4.8%, the Statistics Office's projection for the full year assumes that the economy will expand by a healthier 5.2% pace in the October-March 6-month period. It is this premise that is hard to square with all the macroeconomic data available so far, as well as the assumed estimates for the key expenditure components that together total up to the overall GDP. Take for instance the very cornerstone of demand in the economy, private consumption expenditure. The NSO's projection assumes that consumers would go out and spend an additional 4.77 lakh rupees crore, or almost 12% more, in the second half than what they had spent in the preceding 6 months. Not only do most high-frequency indicators, including automobile sales, belie this assumption, even the RBI's Consumer Confidence Survey points to a decline in non-essential consumption compared to a year ago. The NSO's estimates also paint a picture of a distinct uptick in the final 6 months of the current fiscal in a key sector. Manufacturing, which contracted 0.2% in gross value-added terms in the first half, is now posited to turn around and post a 2% expansion for the full 12 months. This projected revival in the crucial job-generating sector again appears premised more on wishful thinking, given that industrial output data from October showed the sector having shrunk by 2.1% from a year earlier. With private investment activity still becalmed, full-year growth in gross fixed capital formation is estimated at just about 1% compared with 10% in the last fiscal, and a significant shortfall in revenue receipts, leaving the government little room to bump up its own spending within the constraints of the budgeted fiscal deficit target. It may be time for radical solutions. And with the clouds of conflict darkening over the crucial energy-supplying West Asian region, India's economy will be even more vulnerable now to another oil price shock. Clearly, it is time to expedite tangible policy interventions. Window for Peace, The Indian Express. By Editorial, updated, January 9, 2027 hours 50 minutes and 34 seconds am. The Iranian retaliation may have opened a brief window for potential de-escalation of the U.S.-Iran confrontation. On Wednesday morning, Iran delivered the promised retaliatory blow against the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani by raining more than a dozen missiles at U.S. forces in Iraq. In the tense moment that followed, the much-feared military escalation between the U.S. and Iran seemed inevitable. Oil prices spiked and stock markets dipped as the world waited with bated breath for the American response to the missile attack on the U.S. bases. As the dust cleared, though, a counterintuitive possibility came into view, that the Iranian retaliation may have opened a brief window for potential de-escalation of the U.S.-Iran confrontation. Although much uncertainty prevails amidst the continuing room for misjudgment and miscalculation in both Tehran and Washington, a measure of caution seems to be settling down on both capitals as they absorb the full import of a military escalation. Try watching this video on, or enable JavaScript if it is disabled in your browser. There was no doubt that Iranian leadership had to be seen avenging the killing of Soleimani, if only to salvage its political self-esteem and calm the anger among the multiple militias that were commanded by the departed general. Tehran appears to have carefully calibrated the attack to reduce the possibilities for escalation. While sections of the Iranian media claimed scores of Americans died in the missile attack, U.S. and Iraqi forces reported no American casualties. Having hit back visibly, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei could now claim Tehran has slapped Washington on its face. The Iranian foreign minister, Jawad Zarif, quickly affirmed that the attacks on the base concluded Iran's retaliation. He also insisted Tehran has no desire for further escalation. President Trump too seemed to step back a bit by ending the threat to target Iranian cultural sites. Trump, however, would be well advised not to treat Iran's decision to avoid escalation as some kind of victory. The White House, instead, should try and find ways to turn the temporary pause into an opportunity for not only de-escalation but also a long overdue direct political engagement with Iran on the future of the Gulf. It is also a moment for Delhi to consider a more active role in promoting regional peace, for a war in the Gulf will push the struggling Indian economy into the abyss. India's good relations with both the US and Iran positions Delhi well to undertake that exercise. To be sure, Prime Minister Narendra Modi can't overestimate his leverage over Trump and Khamenei and India's ability to influence the course of an entrenched conflict between US and Iran. India's high stakes in the Gulf, however, demand that Modi try his hand at regional peace. Weathering the Storm, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published January 9, 2024 hours 0 minutes and 16 seconds am. Subcontinent has increased by about 2% in the past 4 decades. Such warming has increased the capacity of oceans to form intense cyclonic disturbances. An India Meteorological Department (IMD) report, released on Monday, confirms what climate scientists have been claiming for more than half a decade: extreme weather events have become par for the course in the country. The Statement on Climate of India in 2019 notes that excessive heat, cold and rainfall killed 1,562 people during the year. The mean temperature last year was 0.36 above normal, while the country also recorded excess rainfall during both the southwest and northeast monsoons. Intense dry spells, even droughts, were interspersed with floods in several parts of the country, a phenomenon that policymakers will increasingly be called to factor while drawing up projects in areas as diverse as agriculture, urban planning, water resources and disaster management. The IMD report should be seen in conjunction with long-term meteorological trends. The World Meteorological Organization, for example, reckons that the decade starting 2011 remains on track to be the warmest on record. At the same time, data from the European Centre for Medium-Range Forecast shows that the relative humidity in the mid-troposphere in the subcontinent has increased by about 2% in the past 4 decades. Such warming has increased the capacity of oceans to form intense cyclonic disturbances. Last year, as the IMD report notes, the Indian Ocean witnessed 8 cyclones. Ipso facto, cyclones don't kill but buildings can turn hazardous during such extreme weather events. Last year, in Odisha for instance, winds blowing at more than 140 km per hour ripped off roofs and window frames in modern houses and also exposed the vulnerability of the mud and bamboo houses of the poor. The Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs does have guidelines for climate-friendly construction. But planners in coastal cities and towns rarely pay heed to its provisions. This year, Kerala, southern Karnataka and Gujarat were heavily deficient till July. But within a few days in the last week of July, these states recorded surplus rainfall. For farmers, such vagaries mean disruptions in the entire cropping cycle. Increasing their resilience calls for efficient rainwater storage and use. The changing dynamics of weather also demand cooperation between states that share a river basin. This year, Maharashtra and Karnataka bickered over opening the gates of the Almaty Dam on the Krishna. By the time the two states agreed over the amount of water to be discharged from the dam, the damage was already done. It's clear that dealing with exceptional weather will require interventions at the national, state and local levels. Mining deep, on cabinet easing mining laws, The Hindu. The center's decision to liberalize norms for entry into coal mining and relax regulations on mining and selling coal in the country is significant in many respects. Amendments to two legacy acts through the Mineral Laws Amendment, Ordinance 2020 cleared by the Cabinet on Wednesday will free the sector from restrictions that were inhibiting its development. This will open up the coal mining sector completely, enabling anyone with finances and expertise to bid for blocks and sell the coal freely to any buyer of their choice. Until now there were restrictions on who could bid for coal mines, only those in power, iron and steel and coal washery business could bid for mines, and the bidders needed prior experience of mining in India. This effectively limited the potential bidders to a select circle of players and thus limited the value that the government could extract from the bidding. Second, end-use restrictions inhibited the development of a domestic market for coal. The ordinance essentially democratizes the coal industry and makes it attractive for merchant mining companies, including multinationals such as BHP and Rio Tinto, to look at India. The move was overdue considering that the country spent a huge Rupee 71,000 crore in coal imports last year to buy 235 million tons. Of that, 100 million tons was not substitutable, as the grade was not available in India, but the balance 135 million tons could have been substituted by domestic production had it been available. Large investment in mining will create jobs and set off demand in critical sectors such as mining equipment and heavy commercial vehicles. The country may also benefit from infusion of sophisticated mining technology, especially for underground mines, if multinationals decide to invest. However, for that to happen, the government needs to do more, such as whittling the time taken for approvals of mining leases and also easing the procedures for clearances. The test would come when 46 producing mines, whose leases expire in March, come up for bidding shortly. The opening up of coal mining effectively ends Coal India's (CIL) monopoly status. Coal Minister Pralhad Joshi took care to emphasize that CIL has been and will be allotted adequate blocks and that it will be supported and the interests of laborers will be taken care of. The company has been set a target of 1 billion tons production by 2023-24. Last year, it produced 606 million tons. CIL is a Maharatna PSU and tremendous public resources have been invested in the company over the years. It is the government's responsibility to ensure that CIL is not compromised the way BSNL has been by the opening up to private players. The company employs about 3 lakh people, is listed and is a national asset. It has to be nurtured even as private players are welcomed. A continent on fire, on Australia wildfires, The Hindu. Australia's catastrophic fire season that began in August last year is unprecedented, and has caused large-scale destruction, mainly in New South Wales, NSW, and Queensland. Fire is no stranger to the dry continent's woodlands, but the inferno this time has devastated over 10 million hectares of land, killing at least 25 people and tens of millions of animals, besides forcing the evacuation of entire communities. Shocking images of kangaroos burnt in their tracks as they tried to flee and koalas desperately escaping the fire are indelibly imprinted in the consciousness of people around the world. This is a moment of reckoning for Australia. The government of Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who has sought to downplay the impact of changing climate, is struggling to pacify angry citizens who are calling for a reconsideration of the country's relationship with fossil fuels. Warnings have been sounded by scientists that even with a global average temperature rise of 1 degree Celsius, the raging fires have engulfed an area the size of Switzerland. In a world set to warm at least half a degree more in coming decades, Australia's encounters with devastating fires could become more frequent, perhaps even once in 8 years, making large parts of the continent uninhabitable. The current fire season presents a crossroads, and a wise choice would be to move to a greener future, one that strengthens an already diverse economy through innovation. As scientists have been pointing out for years, the coal industry has a sway over politics in Australia that is disproportionate to its share of economic production. This was evident when Mr. Morrison held up a big piece of the black rock in Parliament in a gesture to highlight its economic importance. The display may have reassured the mining industry, which has torpedoed a profits tax in the past, but it shocked researchers who worry about greenhouse gas emissions increasing in Australia, and in countries to which it exports the fuel. Credentialed specialists at the country's Climate Council have had to crowdsource funds to continue their work after the official Climate Commission was shut down by the government 6 years ago. Today, they are raising the alarm over the lowest ever rainfall recorded in parts of NSW and Queensland, and high peak temperatures, producing a tinderbox effect across the large Murray-Darling Basin. The situation is bound to worsen without policy change, as temperatures are predicted to soar to 50 degrees Celsius. Over the past half-century, the number of hot days and very hot days each year have steadily increased. It would be tragic if this scientific insight is ignored. Long-term prosperity for Australians and a future for its charismatic animals can be secured only through policies that foster environmental protection. Watch massive bushfires across Australia. Coal Comfort, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published January 10, 2021, hour 22 minutes and 9 seconds am. The removal of these restrictions is in line with the objective of facilitating commercial coal mining in the country. In a welcome move, the Union Cabinet has relaxed the regulations for coal mining in India. The ordinance amends the existing provision that allowed only companies engaged in iron and steel, power, coal washing sectors and others to bid for coal mines. Now all end-use restrictions have been removed, easing the entry of companies not engaged in any coal use industry and coal mining. Moreover, existing private owners will now be able to sell their surplus coal in the market. The removal of these restrictions is in line with the objective of facilitating commercial coal mining in the country. India is one of the largest coal producers in the world with an output of 729 million tons in 2018-19. However, despite sluggish economic growth, import shipments have surged from 190 million ton in 2016-17 to 235 million ton in 2018-19. In value terms, imports touched $26.18 billion in 2018-19, up from $15.76 billion in 2016-17. This surge in coal imports, along with oil and electronics imports, has exerted pressure on the country's current account in recent years. The relaxation in regulations, along with previous initiatives such as allowing 100% foreign direct investment through the automatic route in commercial coal production, can aid in boosting coal production in the country and help reduce imports. It will also encourage private players to participate in the auctions that are to be held to reallocate the captive coal blocks that were cancelled by the Supreme Court in 2014. So far, only 29 of the 204 blocks that were cancelled have been auctioned. Production from captive coal blocks had fallen to 25.1 million ton in FY19, down from 43.2 million ton in 2015. With these measures, the government is also facilitating the entry of major global mining players such as Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton, which can help bring in the latest technologies for raising productivity. How quickly these investments fructify depends on the kinds of coal blocks offered, the infrastructure available, the government's ability to ease the regulatory hurdles such as the process of obtaining clearances, and clearing of mining plans that have complicated the process so far. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. Tags. Coal block allocation. 0 comments asterisk. The moderation of comments is automated and not cleared manually by IndianExpress.com. A Star's Trek, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published, January 10, 2022 hours 16 minutes and 35 seconds am. She made no statement on campus, but she didn't need to. Her presence itself was eloquent testimony to a fundamental shift in the relationship between the film industry and society at large, generational as much as political. In 2018, members of a right-wing communitarian organization offered a reward of 5 crore rupees for the murder and decapitation of Deepika Padukone because she played a character in Padmavat which they found offensive. In 2020, Padukone, as herself, exercising her agency as a citizen of India, first praised the young protesters across the country and then visited the Jawaharlal Nehru University campus in New Delhi on Tuesday to stand with protesting students after the brutal attack on them by masked assailants on January 5. She made no statement on campus, but she didn't need to. Her presence itself was eloquent testimony to a fundamental shift in the relationship between the film industry and society at large, generational as much as political. Cinema and politics in India have had a close association stretching back to independence. Many stalwarts from the South India film industry as well as Bollywood have campaigned for mainstream political parties, especially for the dominant party of the time, and even contested elections. But rarely have they been a part of the civil society's response to contentious issues in the national conversation. The current moment marks a departure from that trend. Swara Bhaskar, Dia Mirza, Taapsee Pannu, directors Anurag Kashyap, Anubhav Sinha, Kabir Khan and Alankrita Shrivastava, other young actors like Alia Bhatt and Varun Dhawan have not registered their protest from a partisan political platform. Padukone, for example, did not rail against the government. Instead, she said, "I feel proud that we, the youth, are not afraid of expressing ourselves." The new breed of stars is no longer imprisoned in a gilded cage of likability, of pretending to have no politics or awareness of about what happens outside Tinsel Town for fear of causing offense. The logic behind projecting an image of being distant from the society at large was twofold. First, alienating powerful people would mean a loss of work and potential box office revenue, through threats of boycott, producers and distributors being put under pressure, etc. Second, the actor was seen as a blank slate and, unlike in Hollywood, lineage, right connections and affability were more important for getting work than talent and hard work. The new breed is confident of finding their audience through the quality of their work and the neutrality of a deeper market. They are also unafraid to stand up for their beliefs, against perceived injustice. The latter makes them of a piece with their generation at large, the young men and women out on the streets against the CAA among other issues. The protests, first in the aftermath of police violence at AMU and Jamia Millia Islamia and now, with the attack in JNU, have served to politicize a new generation and generated conversations about the meaning of citizenship, constitutionality and fraternity in the Indian context. The young people working in cinema, it is clear, are not immune from that inspiration. Calls to boycott Padukone and her films are bound to fail for this reason. Society can't necessarily change a generation, but generational change can transform a society. Demographic dividend isn't just about a larger workforce, it also means more young people with courage of their conviction. Applaud that. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. Tags. Deepika Padukone. Eloquently reticent on validity of J&K curbs the Hindu. If enunciating the law and laying down norms for the exercise of executive power were the only functions of a constitutional court, the Supreme Court's verdict on the prolonged lockdown in Jammu and Kashmir, J&K, is indeed admirable. However, the apex court is also a court of justice, one duty-bound to enforce fundamental rights. It cannot limit itself to opinions on the extent to which those rights can be restricted. It has to give effect to the principles it enunciates and rule whether the state violated the fundamental rights of its citizens. The disappointing aspect of the verdict is the court's failure to give a ruling on the validity of the government's actions. It fails to hold the government to account for the manner in which it exercised its powers. It states categorically that an indefinite ban on the Internet is impermissible, but fails to direct the restoration of services. When it says Section 144 of the Code of Criminal Procedure cannot be used as a tool to prevent the legitimate expression of opinion or grievance or exercise of any democratic rights, it makes a comment worthy of being treasured in these times of frequent resort to that section. Yet the court does not go beyond directing the authorities to review all their orders and restrictions forthwith. There are indeed valuable takeaways from the judgment. A key holding is that the use of the Internet as a medium for free speech as well as for trade and commerce is constitutionally protected. It also lays down that any reasonable restriction on fundamental rights, be it an Internet ban or a Section 144 order, will have to survive the test of proportionality, that is, the restriction should be proportionate to the necessity for such a measure. At the same time, it cautions against the excessive utility of the proportionality doctrine in matters of national security. Of great value to future challenges to executive action is the principle that there can be no secret orders. The government is bound to publish all orders it passes regarding such restrictions so that they can be challenged in a court of law. It is here that the verdict acquires another unusual character. Having rejected the government's stand that it could not produce all the orders on the restrictions imposed since August 4, 2019, the court fails to strike them down on that ground. After all, it concurrently says every order imposing a restriction should state the reason, the exigency that necessitated it and the features that make it clear that it is the least intrusive measure. The absence of such order in the public domain is evidence that the state failed to demonstrate its necessity. It is a sign of the success of the national security narrative that undergirds the government's position on J&K that an apex court judgment in a fundamental rights case appears to have the character of an advisory opinion. A health emergency, on risk of international spread of poliovirus, the Hindu. Based on the risk of international spread of poliovirus, the World Health Organization announced on January 7 that polio will continue to remain a public health emergency of international concern (PHEIC) for 3 months. The decision was taken based on the recommendation of the Emergency Committee under the international health regulations that assessed the situation last month. The committee arrived at the unanimous decision based on the rising risk of international spread of wild poliovirus type 1. Polio was declared as PHEIC in 2014 and has continued to remain one since then. There were 156 cases of wild polio type 1 cases in 2019 compared with 28 in 2018. With 128 cases, Pakistan accounted for the most number of cases, while Afghanistan reported 28 cases. Besides the four-fold increase in cases, there were instances of the wild type 1 virus getting exported from Pakistan to Iran and Afghanistan, as also on the spread from Afghanistan to Pakistan. In addition to the virus causing polio in children, it was found in the environment in Pakistan and, to a lesser extent, in Afghanistan. This is particularly a concern as the number of children not vaccinated in Afghanistan has been increasing. In 2018, a total of 60,000 children in Afghanistan did not receive polio vaccine due to security threats. The situation did not improve in 2019 and, as a result, a large cohort of children in the southern region of the country remains unprotected. Therefore, even other parts of the country that have been free of the virus in the past are at risk of outbreaks. An equally disturbing development is on the outbreak of vaccine-derived poliovirus cases in 16 countries. In all, there were 249 vaccine-derived poliovirus cases in 2019. Surprisingly, of them, only 30 were in countries where vaccine-derived poliovirus is endemic. The rapid emergence of multiple circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2 strains in several countries is unprecedented and very concerning, and not yet fully understood, the committee noted. But, not a single case of vaccine-derived poliovirus was reported from Afghanistan, while Pakistan had just 12 cases. In comparison, the number of cases in Angola was 86 and the Democratic Republic of the Congo was 63. While Nigeria reported 18 cases of vaccine-derived poliovirus, not a single case of wild poliovirus type 1 has been reported from the country for over 3 years. The last reported case was in August 2016. A country is said to have eradicated polio when no new case of wild poliovirus is reported for 3 successive years. Nigeria is all set to be declared as having eradicated polio this year, and in turn, the entire African region will become free of wild poliovirus. Checks and Balancing, The Indian Express. By Editorial, published, January 11, 2024 hours 0 minutes and 10 seconds am. While the petitions were specifically about J&K, the questions raised in them have acquired country-wide resonance after protests against the CAA and the proposed NRC. In deciding 2 petitions relating to the situation in Jammu and Kashmir since August 5, the Supreme Court has made a significant set of observations underscoring and reiterating the freedom of expression enshrined in the Constitution. Most importantly, the court, while stating that it would not express any view on declaring the right to access the Internet as a fundamental right, still went on to make it an integral part of the freedom of expression guaranteed under Article 19(I) of the Constitution, emphasizing that expression through this medium is a major means of information diffusion, and that freedom to receive information is vital to expression. The court also made the point that the wider circulation of information or its greater impact cannot be cited as reason to restrict Internet access or justify its denial. It has also pointed out that in a globalized world, restricting the Internet was to restrict the freedom to trade and commerce, protected by Article 19.1g. Any restrictions on freedoms guaranteed under Article 19, the court has observed, would have to be in accordance with the reasonable restrictions provided for in Clause 2 of the same article. It has discussed in detail the need for proportionality in imposing such restrictions and said that it cannot extend beyond necessary duration, nor could it be indefinite. The 3-judge bench rapped the government for refusing to produce before the court orders imposing restrictions on the Internet and on the freedom of movement in J&K, stating that the freedom of information also includes access to information about why restrictions are imposed, including the imposition of Section 144 CRPC. It has emphatically stated that the powers under this section cannot be used to suppress legitimate expression of opinion or grievance or exercise of any democratic rights. After such an elaborate statement of principles, it is surprising, not to say disappointing, that the court did not apply them to provide relief to the 2 petitioners, Kashmir Times executive editor Anuradha Bhasin, and MP Ghulam Nabi Azad, by striking down as illegal the clearly indefinite Internet ban in Kashmir, now fully 5 months old, with a couple of relaxations, and the restrictions on movement and assembly that remain in force in the valley. Instead, it has asked the J&K government to review, forthwith, all orders suspending Internet services, and the continuance of orders passed under Sec. 144 CRPC. Indeed, it appears to have assumed that the restrictions will continue, as it also directs the government to consider forthwith allowing government websites, localized or limited e-banking facilities, hospital and other essential services, in those regions wherein the Internet services are not likely to be restored immediately. While the petitions were specifically about J&K, the questions raised in them have acquired country-wide resonance after protests against the CAA and the proposed NRC. By stating that any order for suspension of Internet can be judicially reviewed, but effectively providing no remedy when such a review came up before it, the court has only left the door open to more litigation. It has pushed back against the state. It needs to do more to secure the people's right in J&K it has so powerfully underlined. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. Tags. Article 370. Jammu and Kashmir bifurcation. Supreme Court. Zero comments *. The opposition within, the Indian Express. By Editorial, published, January 11, 2024 hours 5 minutes and 14 seconds am. Mamata, the face of the citizenship law protests in her state, has explained her decision as an act of protest against the violence unleashed by left and Congress during the general strike on Wednesday. One aspect of the aggressive federal pushback to the new Citizenship Act, the proposed NRC and NPR, has been the broad though tenuous consensus among the major opposition parties to oppose these. However, the contradictions within the opposition have now come to the fore, with West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee deciding to stay away from a meeting convened by Congress Chief Sonia Gandhi. Mamata, the face of the citizenship law protests in her state, has explained her decision as an act of protest against the violence unleashed by left and Congress during the general strike on Wednesday. She had also declined their demand that the West Bengal Assembly pass a resolution against the new Citizenship Act. This is not surprising, since the compulsions of state politics are often at variance with the national narrative. Besides, the requirements of office too can force parties in government to disassociate with certain forms of protest, especially those of opposition groups, even if their interests converge at the national level. Both these tendencies have become visible in non-BJP-ruled states that have seen major mobilizations against the CAA. In Kerala, the ruling CPM-led Left Front and the Congress-led opposition had come together initially to protest the CAA. Soon, the state Congress chief, Mullapalli Ramachandran, claimed a joint struggle against the centre was not a part of the Congress strategy in Kerala. Though the Kerala Legislative Assembly passed a unanimous resolution against the CAA, the CPM and Congress leaders have refused to coordinate their protests or even address the issue from common platforms. The moment of separation for non-BJP parties in West Bengal came when the Trinamool refused to allow the main opposition in the Legislative Assembly, the Left Front and Congress, to capture the anti-BJP space. CM Mamata also accused them of trying to damage the state's economy by resorting to strikes. The challenge for the national opposition would be to manage the state-level contradictions as it tries to build a united front against the center, a task it failed at during the general election. Political parties, especially regional outfits, tend to privilege their local electoral interests over larger ideological concerns, which limits the prospect of any collective action at the national level. The absence of opposition unity may have a limited impact in the case of anti-CAA protests, since much of it has been mobilizations of students and young people. For all the latest opinion news, download Indian Express app. Tags. Citizenship Amendment Act. Mamata Banerjee. Zero comments *. Asterisk the moderation of comments is automated and not cleared manually by IndianExpress.com.